Hey everyone, this is Pete. Welcome back to Atari Flashback Classics, a series of explorations of the 150 games that make up Atari Flashback Classics on Nintendo Switch. Today's game is Combat, which was a launch title for the Atari 2600, or Atari VCS video computer system as it was known back then. This was back in 1977, and it was included as a pack-in game with the system until 1982. It was based on two older Atari arcade games from around about 1974 and 1975 called Tank and Jet Fighter, respectively. Combat is regarded as the grandfather of competitive multiplayer games that are based on sort of violent conflict, like shooting and blowing things up and that sort of thing. It wasn't the first to do this. As we've seen, there are already two arcade games that preceded this, but they're not nearly as well known as Combat was. So it was largely the fact that for 5 full years, pretty much everyone who owned an Atari VCS or Atari 2600 had a copy of this game. So it was very popular, very well known. And today its appeal is actually a little bit limited by the fact you can only play it in simultaneous 2-player mode, which was actually one of its original selling points. But with the fact that gaming these days tends to be a bit more of a solitary experience, or online if you're playing multiplayer, yeah, it kind of limits Combat's appeal a bit these days. You have to actually get people together in the same room for you. Now, packages like Atari Flashback Classics do provide the opportunity to play Combat online, but yeah, good luck finding a matchmaking partner in that. It's something you very much have to set up in advance with other people. But it's still a good party game, so if you have people over, do be sure to bring out Combat, because its 27 different game variations make for, yeah, a lot of variety and a lot of fun. So, let's go play Combat.
Alright, welcome back to Atari Flashback Classics. I'm doing something a little bit different today, so excuse the lack of face cam. I'm having to work with some pre-recorded footage today. For various reasons I wasn't able to record some commentary while we were playing the game. So, having found it rather difficult to find a suitable opponent for some 2-player matches in Combat and its sequel Combat 2, I recruited my wife once again, who has helped me out on a couple of previous occasions. But in order to take a bit of a stress and pressure off her, I said we could just record the gameplay and I would do the commentary afterwards. So I will attempt to make this exciting, like esports, because Combat is, as you know, the original esport. So we'll be forgoing the traditional look through the manual today in favour of just some gameplay footage, and I will do my best to explain what's going on as we see what's going on, basically. So we're playing the basic Game 1 of Combat here. That's me on the left in the red, and my wife in the blue. My wife claims not to be able to aim at things, and so far she is proving that to be perfectly accurate. Now, the default gameplay mode in Combat here features guided missiles, which is very much a thing that was present in a lot of late 70s and early 80s games. Now, what that essentially meant was you could fire your shot, and then after you had fired it, but before it disappeared from the screen, you could change its direction. In the case of Combat here, that means you could fire a shot out the front of your tank, turn your tank, and your shot will turn with you. And so in that way you can basically fire around corners. Now that means you can get some quite clever trick shots. It's completely unrealistic, obviously, but it's a lot of fun. And as you can see, while my wife is getting used to the controls, which involves turning left and right and pushing forwards, rather than simply pushing in the direction you want to move in, which is something she's a bit more accustomed to, I am currently decimating her, although she has managed to make it not a complete clean sweep, which is nice for her. Now, there's a few little idiosyncrasies you'll notice in the tank game in Combat in particular, which is that if you can get someone into kind of a bit of a cycle of destroying them, you'll see that you can repeatedly shoot them over and over again and get loads of points. There is a certain amount of countermeasure to that, in the fact that if you shoot someone off the side of the screen, they will reappear on the other side, which will force you to go and get them. But if you're sort of having a bit of a Barney in the middle of the stage, you can get several easy points in quick succession without your opponent being able to do a huge amount about it, which is a bit of a problem. But what you have to remember is that this was a launch game for the Atari VCS. Well, the 2600 as it became later known. So, at this point, genres were still very much being established. Game designers were figuring out what worked and what didn't work, and mechanics and game logic and all that sort of thing. And so you have to expect there to be a certain number of teething issues as they figure things out. Now you might think on paper, the idea of you shoot your opponent, they fly backwards a short way and spin out is a perfectly logical thing to do. But as you can see right here, it doesn't necessarily work perfectly. Although that said, my wife is very much finding her feet much more in this particular match than she was in the original, now taking full advantage of the strategy I've just been talking about. Currently with an 8-5 lead, 9-5 now. Also discovering the fine art of rapid fire in early video games, which involves sitting close to a wall or enemy so that your shot spends less time on screen. Because due to technical limitation, you could only have one shot on screen at once. And that means if you can find a way to get rid of your shot more quickly, such as firing it straight into a wall, you can fire more rapidly. That's not super useful or anything, but it is quite satisfying if you can manage to catch someone in that sort of crossfire. So the mode we're playing here, as you can see, has a maze. There's two variations on the maze. There's the easy maze and the hard maze. This is the hard maze, which provides a lot more in the way of obstacles for you to contend with. Now, in the case of this basic game that we're playing here, all the walls do is get in the way. But as you'll see in a game that we're going to play in just a moment, there are some interesting variations that involve the mazes and the walls they're in. So, with the numbers flashing at the top of the screen, that means we're into the last few seconds of the match. And as with a lot of other 2600 games, each match in this lasts for, I think it's 2 minutes and 16 seconds or something random like that. And as I think we said back when we looked at, oh, what was that? Air-Sea Battle, I think. That number was chosen semi-arbitrarily. It was chosen because it seemed like a fun amount of time to play for. It doesn't seem like it's too long, doesn't seem like it's too short. It feels like a suitable amount of time to get some stuff done, score some points, have a nice competitive match between two people. And so, yes, we are now moving on into the tank pong mode, which is where your shots bounce, as you can see right here. So, that means you can bounce them around corners and take out your opponent in various creative ways. You don't get any additional points for doing trick shots or anything like that, but it is a good way of humiliating your opponent nicely if you enjoy that sort of thing. Now, there is also a variant on tank pong that requires you to bounce your shot off at least one wall before you can hit your opponent with it. That is probably the mode for real combat pros, because that demands a considerably stronger understanding of maths than either I or my wife have, as you can see from our pitiful attempts to ricochet shots into each other here. It's not going too well. But we were trying. We were trying really hard. But most of the time, it just ran down to getting pretty close to each other, inserting our barrels into each other's tanks, and repeatedly firing until someone fell over. Currently, victory is looking pretty likely for me, which is fine by me. Although it's testament to this game's sort of simple to understand mechanics that after just a couple of games, my wife is getting noticeably better at driving the tank and getting accurate shots on me and scoring points and that sort of thing. So this part of combat is probably the most well-known aspect of it. There are some other points that we'll get onto a little bit later in this video. But the tank battles for many people are a highlight because they're reasonably slow-paced. They're easy to understand. You can be quite strategic about them. And once you get your head around the basic controls, it's reasonably straightforward. So, next up, we're going to spend a moment just picking what to do next. Now, combat has, I think it's 27 variations altogether. And as with most 2600 games, you have to cycle around all of them if you want to go back. So, our next effort is the invisible tank with guided missiles and an easy maze. So you see, this is a slightly less complicated maze layout, but your tanks are invisible. Now, they're not invisible for the whole match. As you can see, whenever you fire, you reveal your location. And also, whenever you run into a wall, you also reveal your location that way as well. So, success in this mode depends on you being able to understand and visualize where you are as much as possible without revealing your location. And watching out for the telltale signs of your opponent's location. Because you need to be able to take them out quickly and efficiently, preferably without them knowing where you are. It is in many ways the Atari VCS's answer to something like Scotland Yard, although with more shooting and less arresting and riding on the London Underground. Now, as you can see, an invisible tank match tends to be a bit of a lower scoring round because you spend a lot of time figuring out where you are, running into walls, and determining how you're going to do things. And you see, once again, we run into the issue where you can repeatedly shoot someone, keep knocking them back in the same direction, and get a bunch of points almost for free, really. And so getting the hang of combat is partly being able to aim and judge your shots carefully, which is obviously a really important part of the game, but also playing in such a way that you avoid putting yourself in that sort of situation as much as possible. Because if you can manage to keep yourself at a reasonable distance from your opponent, or use the walls effectively in order to sort of get around them and take cover, then you can avoid getting yourself into a situation where you're just feeding your opponent points. As you can see there, you can also play invisible tank pong, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's invisible tanks with bouncing shots. So I chose to spare my wife the indignity of that because it's pretty difficult. Oh, no, I didn't. No, I didn't. I apologise. I misremembered. But yes, this is tank pong with invisible tanks, which can politely be described as mostly dumb luck. Now, I don't actually remember what the final score was in this case, but I don't think it was particularly high. But again, if you're playing on the mode where you don't have to bounce your shot before it hits someone, you can get in a few sneaky shots without having to worry about the ricochet aspect. Although that was quite a nice shot from me there, wasn't it? Rather nice. Oh, bit of a miss there. Oh, another shot. And off the side of the screen and reappearing on the bottom, as you can see. So that is, like I say, a slight counter to the problem of getting stuck in a cycle of being blown back by your opponent's shots, but it doesn't quite solve the problem. It kind of mitigates some aspects of it, but it doesn't solve it completely. And so I think the way around that, to ensure that that doesn't happen too much, is to try and stay on the move as much as possible. It is quite tempting to just sit still and repeatedly lob shots at your opponent and try and get as many quick points in as you possibly can, but getting out of the line of fire as quickly as possible is important. And with the nature of the collisions in this, sometimes that can actually just be as simple as rotating your tank a few degrees to one side. But more often than not, you'll probably want to move at a right angle to the path of your opponent's shots. So that will force them to turn and perhaps move in order to be able to get back to you. But as you can see, my wife was struggling somewhat with this particular mode. I was expecting her to. This is a difficult mode. This is very much Combat Pro, if you will. And there we go, 17-0. Absolute clean sweep. So, after the tank games, we move on to the biplanes. which, again, very simple. All you need to do, 2 minutes 16 seconds or whatever the amount of time is, and you just have to shoot each other down as many times as possible. So the difference here is that you are constantly moving. And also the control scheme is slightly different. Because this is viewed from a side-on perspective rather than a top-down perspective, you push up and down to change direction rather than left and right. So you push down or pull back on the stick to raise your nose. And you push forward on the stick or push up in order to lower your nose. And you'll notice that when you're flying to the left, your plane is upside down. So that means your controls are inverted when you're doing that. So again, that's something you need to get used to a bit. Although one could argue that is perhaps slightly simpler than the tank controls. But you do, especially if you just come from the tank game, you do have to sort of get your head around the fact you're looking at things from the side now rather than from the top. And some people find themselves particularly struggling with the inverted controls when you're facing to the left. Now once again, there's a number of different variations of this one. Obviously mazes in the sky don't make sense, but you have versions with clouds like this one. You have the option for guided missiles once again, as you can see here. So once again, if you fire your shot and then change your direction after you've fired it, your shot will also change direction as well, again allowing you to curl it around corners. And also there's no border around the outside of the screen in this one. So when you fly off the side of the screen, you reappear on the other side, and also that is true for your shots as well. So if you fire off the right hand side of the screen, your shot will continue to travel and reappear on the left hand side. They do have a maximum range, so you can't just sort of keep a shot flying perpetually. But as you can see, when we fire a shot here, it does travel most of the width of the screen. So depending on when you let your shot go, you can do some quite clever things and trick your opponent using the screen wraparound if you're sensible and careful. Right, accidentally started a new biplanes game there. So we then move on to biplanes with what it calls repeating missiles. This is also known as the machine gun mode. Now what this mode means is that you can simply hold down the fire button and fire much shorter range shots than in that mode we were just playing. And so in some ways this mode almost becomes kind of a sword fight, because there's absolutely no reason to not be firing at all times in this mode. So what happens is your plane effectively becomes a sword, with the hilt, or the plane being the vulnerable part. And you're moving the blade around to try and intersect it with your opponent's vulnerable plane. Now for my money, I found this mode a bit more accessible than the basic biplanes mode, because it's much closer range. So that means you both need to be up in each other's face all the time, if you want to score some points, that is. And also the short range means that you don't have to worry quite so much about being super accurate, because you're going to be close to your opponent anyway. So like I say, it's almost like a melee combat situation. Not quite, because there is a bit of range on them, but it's almost like melee combat. Yeah, I really like this mode. It's a lot of fun. It's super simple, and probably not one that the sort of real pros will want to play, but as a particularly accessible mode that's good for sort of party play, yeah, this is a really good one. This is a really fun one. And as you can see from the scores, the nature of this mode meant that my wife and I were pretty evenly matched in this one, which is good. That for me is always a good sign. It's always a really encouraging sign when we have a match where we can at least be fairly competitive. Because although it can be fun to have a complete clean sweep on someone sometimes, it's a bit more fun for everyone involved if there's a bit of competition involved. I mean, I still won, because, well, you know. But there we go. So, we then move on to Biplanes 2 vs 2, which is basically the same game, only you're controlling two planes at once. Now, this isn't as complicated as it sounds. All it means is that you control 2 sprites instead of 1. You can't separate them or anything like that. They just both fire. Now, this adds a couple of interesting tactical options to the mix. Because when you are firing upwards or downwards, or basically any direction other than straight horizontally, you cover a much wider range with your shots, making you more likely to hit your target. And compounding that fact is the fact that the targets you are aiming for are bigger as well, because instead of trying to hit just one plane, you've got 2 you can try and hit. So again, this tends to be quite a high scoring game because it's quite easy to hit each other in this one. But again, there's scopes for some interesting strategies here. So you need to try and figure out how you can... You can't really make yourself a smaller target because you can't change the formation of your planes. Although you are a slightly narrower target when you're going up and down. And again, you can make effective use of the screen wraparound to bamboozle your opponent. But again, as you can see, it's a fairly even match between my wife and I in this one. Meaning that this is quite an accessible, fun game when you're playing against someone who is of a slightly different skill or experience level to you. And as you can see, there's a lot of fun to be had with those wraparound shots. You have very long range shots in this one, so plenty of scope for sort of picking people off from a distance, firing off the edge of the screen like that, and getting in some sneaky points right at the last minute. So this one really is down to the wire. 14 to 12 in the last few seconds. I think I started just playing defensively there. There we go. Alright, moving on. Our next game, we have the biplanes versus the bomber. So this is an asymmetrical game. What we have in this one is that the left player controls a large bomber, which is just one of the 2600's large sprites. As you can see, it's the exact same sprite as the biplane, but at much lower resolution, making it appear bigger. And then the right-hand player controls 3 biplanes flying in formation, much like in the previous game. And so in this mode, you've both got sort of your own advantages and disadvantages to deal with. So the bomber's main advantage is that it fires absolutely enormous shots, which makes it much easier to hit a target. But of course its main downside is the fact that it too is absolutely enormous, making it very easy to hit. And the 3 biplanes, they obviously have a gap between them, which makes them slightly more difficult to hit. But also the fact they cover quite a wide area means that the bomber is quite likely to hit them. So it's kind of difficult to say who has the advantage in this mode. Because there's aspects of being on both sides that kind of sucks. But the fact it's asymmetrical makes this really interesting, I think. So again, this is another one with sort of quite even scoring, as you can see. So my wife was doing pretty well with this one. Sort of taking down the bomber repeatedly. Once she got into kind of the groove of firing long shots, firing off the side of the screen and that sort of thing, she really got the hang of sort of scoring points in rapid succession on this one. And you see that this game kind of mitigates the problem that the tank battles had, in that you keep moving after you've hit your target. And so you can't just sit there and repeatedly fire out shots in the same direction and hit your same target over and over again. So that kind of fixes the problem that was present in the tank mode. But the tank mode is still the probably the most well-known and most played mode in combat. Which is a bit of a shame, really, because these later variations are really fun. So we're now moving on to the jet fighter mode, which is kind of a blend of the biplanes and the tank mode. So now, rather than unfolding from a top-down... I beg your pardon. Rather than unfolding from a side-on perspective, as in the biplanes, we're back to a top-down perspective. But we have the clouds from the biplane mode, and we also have the borderless nature of the playfield, meaning that you can wrap around off the edge, fire your shots off the edge, and all that sort of thing. You can also vary your speed in this one, so you can turn left and right by pushing left and right on the joystick, and you can also push forward and back to adjust your speed between sort of medium, slow, and fast. And so again, this mode kind of mitigates the main problem with the tank battles, in that when you hit your target, you keep flying on. So you can't just keep filling them with missiles and scoring point after point after point after point, which is good. However, some of this is counterbalanced a bit in this mode by the fact that the increased speed of this mode makes it a bit more challenging, particularly for those who don't have quite so much experience. So, my wife struggled a little bit with this one, just because sort of the number of things you have to think about at once in this one. So you have to think about which direction you're going, how fast you're going, staying out of the area that your opponent threatens, and also trying to hit them. So it's a lot of things to think about at the same time in this one. And also the speed means that you have to aim very, very carefully in order to hit them as well. So again, you can see that there's a number of variations to this. You've got guided missiles, you've got with and without clouds. And then, much like with biplanes, we've got some where you fly in formation as well. So here we've got 2 jets against 2 jets. Otherwise, it's the exact same game, but you have the same kind of pros and cons in this as you do in the biplane. So if you're flying right to left or left to right, then you're effectively only really firing one bullet. Whereas if you're firing diagonally or up and down, you're covering a much wider area with your shot. So you can use that to your advantage if you're sensible. But this one is a slightly more accessible take on the jet fighter mode in that you've got bigger targets. So to a certain degree, that kind of makes up for the fact that it's moving faster and it's more difficult to hit your opponents because they're moving faster and because they're quite small in the first place. And you can see that's kind of reflected in the scores here. So it's much more even this time around. There's one thing I find really interesting in this game is the fact that just one small change to the mechanics, such as flying 2 planes instead of 1, can have such a huge impact on the accessibility of the game and how enjoyable it is for players of different skill levels. And I guess that's the main reason that many of these early 2600 games had so many variations. It's so that people of all ages and ability levels and experience levels and comparative skill levels to one another could have a good time. So if you weren't getting on with a particular mode in combat, you weren't stuck with just one game that you couldn't play with your family. You could switch to one of the other 26 modes and see if that was better for you. And as you can hopefully see from our playthrough today, different people clearly latch onto certain modes better than others. Which is cool. And then we have another asymmetrical mode here. Or at least we do, if I can cycle through to it. So this time around, this is a bit like the bomber mode, but the difference is the player who is flying a single plane is just normal sized. So they don't have a giant sprite to contend with or anything like that. So they are at a noticeable advantage in this one. Because although they're harder to hit, it's also a little bit harder for them to hit their opponents because they don't cover quite as much space with their shots. But on the whole, I think they mostly have the advantage edge because of them being a much smaller target. And again, being a smaller target combined with the high speed of the jet fighter modes just kind of benefits the player who is by themselves. Although again, look at the scores. Pretty even. Pretty evenly matched. So maybe it does balance out somewhat. As you can see, me in the orange fighter, I'm having quite a lot of trouble actually hitting those 3 planes. Because again, although it's quite a large target in total, it still has gaps between the planes. So you can still fire a shot and it be mostly on target. But if it just whistles between 2 of them, that's no good at all. So maybe it does balance out. Maybe it does balance out a bit. Even if it doesn't though, it's quite a good thing to have a sort of asymmetrical mode that favours one player over the other. Because that way, if someone who is experienced with or good at the game is playing against someone who's new to it or not quite so good or younger or something like that, then that means you can give the appropriate benefits or drawbacks to the relevant players. So you can give the less experienced player the advantage of having multiple planes, assuming that actually is an advantage, as I assume. And the score would certainly seem to bear that out. I just realised that's the complete opposite of what I just argued, wasn't it? But yeah, judging by the score, having the multiple planes seems to be the one that puts you in the favoured position in that one. Okay, so last of all, we have 2 jets on each side with no clouds. And that just gives us the opportunity for a bit of deathmatch. No holds barred deathmatch. Firing off the sides, wrapping around the screen. Again, I'm taking a bit of a pounding there. Starting to make a comeback, which is good. But again, this is sort of taking the jet fighter formula and making it a little bit more accessible, I guess, because you've got the high speed, but you've also got the bigger targets, which is making it easier for both sides to hit each other. And again, you lack the problem from the tank battles, in that the player who scores a point keeps flying, and you see they just sail straight past the target they've just hit, meaning that they can't just keep firing the same shots over and over again, getting point after point after point. So again, this one, which is actually the last game mode on the cartridge, is actually a pretty well balanced mode for people of sort of varying skill levels, I guess. You got fairly simple, straightforward controls. You've not got the clouds to worry about, so nothing to hide in. You've got reasonably large targets to hit. You've got the ability to cover quite a large area with your shots. And it makes for quite an interesting conflict. And so yeah, this is a pretty good way to round off our session, I guess. As we reach the closing seconds of the match, I guess it just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please help out the channel by leaving a like or a comment and subscribing. New episodes of Atari A to Z are on Tuesdays and Atari ST A to Z on Thursdays. Check out atariatoz.wordpress.com for a full archive. Do please also check out my other projects moegamer.net, where I explore Japanese and Japanese-inspired games from yesterday and today, and videopackgames.wordpress.com, which aims to catalogue the small but well-formed library of the Philips G7000 Videopack computer, also known as the Magnavox Odyssey 2. You can also support my work on Patreon or buy me a coffee. You can find links to do both down in the video description. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.